What if the reason you still feel stuck is not because your vibration is too low, but because you have been taught to fight yourself in the name of becoming better? For years, people have been told that raising their vibration means thinking more positively, acting more spiritually, and forcing themselves into a higher emotional state. But look closely at what that idea creates. The moment you believe you must become something better than what you are, you quietly declare that what you are now is not enough. And that hidden judgment becomes tension. It becomes pressure. It becomes resistance disguised as growth. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Because the more desperately you try to rise, the more you reinforce the belief that you are beneath where you should be. And from that inner split, your energy contracts. You may smile, repeat affirmations, speak beautiful words, and still feel the heaviness underneath it all.
Why?
Because your body cannot relax into peace while your mind is treating the present moment like a problem to solve. That is why so many people feel exhausted on the spiritual path. They are trying to heal through self-rejection. They are trying to access love by resisting what they feel. They are trying to become light while secretly fighting their own darkness. But what if elevation was never about climbing? What if the real shift begins the moment you stop asking, "How do I become higher?" and start asking a far more liberating question: what am I still resisting that keeps me from remembering what I already am? What if the version of you that you've been trying so hard to become is actually the very thing standing in the way of your freedom? There is a subtle, almost invisible trap in personal growth that most people never question. It's the idea that transformation requires construction, that you must build a new identity layer by layer until you finally arrive at a better version of yourself. But what if that entire process is built on a false premise? Because every time you try to become something, you create distance from what already exists. And that distance is not neutral. It generates effort, tension, and an ongoing sense of incompleteness. You begin to chase a future version of yourself that always feels just out of reach. And without realizing it, you trap your sense of worth in a destination that never fully arrives. But real transformation doesn't work like that. In quantum terms, reality doesn't respond to who you're trying to become. It reflects the state you are already embodying. Not your intentions. Not your desires. Your being. And being is not something you manufacture. It is something you uncover. This is where everything begins to shift. Because what if you are not here to build yourself, but to remove everything that is not truly you? What if the process is not about addition but subtraction? The beliefs that told you to perform, the emotional armor you learned to survive, the roles you adopted to be accepted. All of it forms a structure that feels like you but isn't. And the moment you stop trying to become, something unexpected happens. You begin to remember. Not intellectually but somatically. There is a quiet recognition that emerges underneath the noise. A sense that who you are has never been missing, only covered. So instead of asking, "What do I need to become?" a more powerful question begins to open. What am I willing to release to finally experience myself as I already am? If this is resonating with you, take a moment to subscribe and like the video. It helps this message reach those who need it and supports deeper content like this. If nothing needs to be built, then what is left when everything unnecessary falls away? Pause for a moment and really feel into that question. Because beneath all the effort, beneath all the noise, beneath every identity you've ever tried to maintain, there is something that has never changed. Something that does not need improvement, validation, or protection. And yet, it is the very thing you've been searching for in every external achievement, every relationship, every moment of temporary clarity. What if that is your natural state? Not a peak experience, not a reward, not something reserved for rare moments of alignment, but the baseline of your existence, love, joy, and peace, not as emotions you chase, but as what remains when resistance dissolves. This is where most people misunderstand the process. They believe love must be created, that peace must be earned, that joy must be activated. But in reality, these states are not constructed, they are revealed. They are always present beneath the layers of tension, fear, and control that the mind continuously reinforces. And this is not philosophy. It is observable. Think about the moments when you felt completely at ease, not because everything was perfect, but because, for a brief instant, you stopped resisting what was. In that space, there was nothing to fix, nothing to prove, nothing to protect. And suddenly, without effort, there was openness, lightness, presence. That is not something you achieved. That is something you stopped interfering with. So the real question is no longer, how do I feel better? It becomes something far more honest and far more powerful. What am I doing right now that is blocking the peace that is already here? If love is your natural state, why does it so often feel out of reach? This is where one of the deepest confusions begins, the confusion between love and attachment. Because what most people call love is not actually love. It is the fear of losing, the need to control, the desire to hold on to something so tightly that it cannot move. And underneath all of that, there is resistance. Resistance to change. Resistance to uncertainty. Resistance to what is. And that resistance creates contraction in the body. You can feel it, can't you? The tension in your chest when something doesn't go the way you expected. The tightness in your stomach when you sense distance, rejection, or loss. The subtle urgency to fix, to secure, to guarantee an outcome. That is not love. That is the nervous system trying to protect you from discomfort. But here's the paradox. The more you try to hold on, the more you create the very instability you're trying to avoid. Because life, by nature, is movement. It flows, it shifts, it evolves. And the moment you resist that flow, you create friction. That friction becomes emotional pain. This is why attachment leads to suffering. Not because caring is wrong, but because control is impossible. And the deeper truth begins to reveal itself when you look honestly. What you are attached to is not the person, the outcome, or the situation. It is the feeling you believe those things give you. Security, validation, wholeness. But what if those were never coming from outside in the first place? What if the suffering you feel is not from losing something, but from resisting the natural movement of life? And what if, in releasing that resistance, you don't lose love, but finally experience it without fear? What if your natural state has never been lost, only held down? Imagine a cork floating on the surface of the ocean. Now, imagine someone pushing it underwater. The deeper it's forced down, the more pressure builds. The more resistance is applied, the stronger the upward force becomes. And the moment that pressure is released, what happens? It doesn't struggle to rise. It doesn't need motivation, discipline, or strategy. It simply returns instantly, effortlessly, to where it naturally belongs. This is you. Not in theory, but in energetic reality. Your natural state, peace, openness, clarity, does not require effort to exist. It requires the absence of resistance. But most people live as if their hand is constantly pushing that cork down, without even realizing it. Every suppressed emotion, every forced positive thought, every moment you tell yourself, I shouldn't feel this. That is pressure. And over time, that pressure doesn't disappear, it accumulates. It becomes tension in your body, noise in your mind, and a constant background feeling that something isn't quite right. So you try harder. You push for better thoughts. You search for higher states. You attempt to control your inner world, not realizing that the very effort is what keeps you submerged. This is the hidden loop. The more you try to rise, the more you reinforce the pressure holding you down. But what if the solution is not to push upward, but to gently remove what is pushing downward? What if you don't need to elevate yourself, but simply stop interfering with your own natural return? And if that's true, what, right now, are you still holding down that is ready to rise the moment you let go? What if the very habit you've been told will fix your state is actually keeping you stuck in it? Just think more positive. It sounds simple, encouraging even, but have you ever noticed what happens the moment you try to force a better thought while something inside you feels heavy, tense, or unsettled? There's a split. On one side, the mind is trying to climb, reaching for something lighter, cleaner, more acceptable. On the other, the body is still holding what hasn't been processed. And instead of resolving that tension, the new thought is placed on top of it like a layer of paint over a crack that hasn't been repaired. At first, it looks fine, but underneath, nothing has changed. This is why forced positivity often creates exhaustion. Because you're not actually shifting your state, you're managing it. You're trying to override a signal instead of understanding it. And the body always knows the difference. In fact, the more you try to replace a feeling without allowing it, the more persistent it becomes. Not because something is wrong with you, but because your system is intelligent. It's asking to be felt, not silenced. And this is where the deeper realization begins. Thoughts do not create peace when they are used to escape discomfort. They create tension. Because peace is not something the mind manufactures. It is something that emerges when the inner conflict dissolves. So instead of asking, "How do I think better?" a more transformative question begins to open. What am I unwilling to feel that I'm trying to think my way out of? If ignoring your emotions doesn't make them disappear, where do they actually go? This is a question most people never stop to ask because on the surface, avoidance seems to work. You distract yourself. You stay busy. You replace discomfort with productivity, entertainment, or even positive thinking. And for a while, it feels like you've moved on. But have you? Or have you simply postponed the experience? Because the body doesn't forget what the mind tries to bypass. Every unprocessed emotion doesn't vanish. It gets stored. Not as a memory you consciously revisit, but as a subtle imprint in your nervous system. It becomes tension in your muscles, patterns in your reactions, and invisible filters through which you perceive reality. This is why the same emotional loops repeat. Not because life is against you, but because something within you is still waiting to be felt. Think about it. Have you ever overreacted to something small and wondered, why did that affect me so much? That intensity didn't come from the moment itself. It came from accumulated, unresolved emotion that had no other outlet. Suppression doesn't solve, it compounds. And over time, what you avoid begins to shape how you think, how you act, and even what you attract. Because your external reality doesn't just reflect your conscious intentions, it mirrors your internal state, including what you've pushed out of awareness. So the real question is no longer, how do I get rid of this feeling? It becomes something far more honest and far more liberating. What has been living inside me, waiting for my permission to finally be felt? What if the real shift doesn't begin when you change your thoughts, but when you stop believing them? Notice how automatic your thinking is. A thought appears and almost instantly, You treat it as truth. You don't question it. You don't observe it. You become it. And from that moment, your entire state begins to organize around something that may not even be real. But what if thoughts are not commands but events? What if they are not instructions to follow, but signals to witness? This is where awareness begins to separate from identification. Because the moment you notice a thought, truly notice it, something subtle happens. You are no longer inside it. You are looking at it. And that distance, however small, changes everything. For the first time, there is space. And in that space, you begin to see patterns, repetitions, old narratives that have been playing on a loop for years, shaping how you feel, how you react, and what you expect from life. Thoughts that once felt like reality begin to reveal themselves as conditioned responses. Not truth, but programming. This is the beginning of freedom, not because the thoughts disappear, but because you are no longer bound to them. You can feel something without building a story around it. You can experience a moment without projecting meaning onto it. You can observe your mind without being controlled by it. And from this place, something opens. A quiet, stable awareness that was always there, just unnoticed. So instead of asking, how do I change my thoughts? A deeper question begins to guide you. What happens when I simply watch, without becoming what I see? If you can observe your thoughts, then who is the one doing the observing? Sit with that for a moment. Because this question doesn't ask for an intellectual answer, it invites an experience. The moment you notice a thought, there is already a separation. There is the thought, and there is something aware of it. And that awareness is not reacting. It is not judging. It is not trying to fix anything. It is simply present. This is where one of the most profound realizations begins to emerge. You are not your thoughts, your emotions, or your patterns. Those are experiences passing through you, not definitions of who you are. But most people never see this. They build their identity around what they think, what they feel, and how they behave. I am anxious. I am overwhelmed. I am this kind of person. And over time, these labels become solid. They feel permanent. But are they? Or are they just repeated experiences that you've learned to identify with? Because the moment you step back and observe, even briefly, something shifts. You begin to see that thoughts come and go. Emotions rise and fall. Patterns activate and deactivate. None of them stay. But the awareness that notices them, that remains. Unchanging, silent, stable. And this is not a concept. It is something you can directly sense. A presence behind everything. A stillness that exists even when your mind is loud, even when your emotions are intense. This is your foundation. Not the changing content of your experience, but the space in which all experience happens. So the question is no longer, how do I control what I feel or think? It becomes something far more powerful. What happens when I begin to rest as the one who is aware instead of everything I am aware of? If your mind is always active, is the goal really to silence it or to stop being controlled by it? This is where many people misunderstand meditation. They approach it as a tool to eliminate thoughts, to achieve a perfectly quiet mind, to reach some ideal state of stillness. And when that doesn't happen, when thoughts keep appearing, when the mind keeps moving, they assume they are doing it wrong. But what if nothing is wrong? What if the mind was never meant to be silenced, but simply seen clearly? Because the problem is not that thoughts exist. The problem is that you are entangled with them. You are pulled into every story, every interpretation, every internal narrative, as if each one demands your participation. Meditation is not about stopping that flow. It is about stepping out of it. It is the practice of creating space between you and the noise. A space where thoughts can arise without immediately becoming your identity, where emotions can move without needing to be controlled, where you begin to witness the activity of the mind instead of being consumed by it. And in that space, something unexpected happens. The mind may still be active, but it loses its authority, because you are no longer reacting to every thought as if it defines reality. You are observing it, allowing it and letting it pass. And gradually, without force, the intensity begins to soften. Not because you controlled it, but because you stopped feeding it. So instead of asking, how do I stop thinking? A more precise question begins to emerge. What changes when I no longer treat every thought as something I must follow? What if the tension you feel isn't coming from your thoughts themselves, but from your attempt to control them? Pay attention to what happens when an uncomfortable thought appears. Almost instantly, there is a reaction, a subtle tightening, a desire to replace it, fix it, push it away, or override it with something better. And in that moment, a quiet struggle begins, not with the thought itself, but with your resistance to it. This is where tension is created, because control, at its core, is contraction. The more you try to manage every thought, the more your system remains on alert. It becomes vigilant, hyper-aware, constantly scanning for anything that needs to be corrected. And instead of finding peace, you find exhaustion.
Why?
Because the mind was never designed to be controlled at that level. It generates thoughts the way the heart beats, continuously, automatically, without asking for permission. And the moment you take responsibility for regulating every single one, you enter an impossible task. But here's what most people don't see. The effort to control thought is itself a form of resistance. And resistance amplifies what it tries to suppress. Have you ever tried not to think about something and found it becoming even more persistent? That's not failure. That's the natural consequence of resistance feeding attention back into the very thing you're trying to avoid. So the real shift is not in controlling thought. It's in changing your relationship to it, allowing it to exist without needing to intervene. Letting it arise without assigning meaning, watching it move without attaching identity. And from that place, something begins to loosen, not because you forced it, but because you finally stopped fighting what was never meant to be fought. So ask yourself, what if peace is not on the other side of controlling your mind, but on the other side of no longer needing to? What if the shift you've been searching for doesn't come from thinking more, but from finally allowing yourself to feel? For most of your life, you've been trained to live in your head, to analyze, to interpret, to explain, to solve. And while the mind is incredibly powerful, it has one limitation that changes everything. It cannot process emotion. It can only describe it. So when something uncomfortable arises, what do most people do? They think about it. They try to understand it, fix it, reframe it, or escape it through logic. But while the mind is busy creating explanations, the body is still holding the experience. The sensation remains. The energy stays unresolved. And this is where the real disconnect happens. Because emotional energy doesn't dissolve through analysis, it dissolves through presence, through feeling, not dramatizing it, not acting it out, but allowing it to move through your system without resistance, without labeling it as wrong, without rushing to get rid of it. This is what most people avoid, because feeling requires vulnerability. It requires letting go of control. It asks you to stay with something that doesn't have immediate resolution. But here's the paradox. The moment you fully allow a feeling, without trying to change it, it begins to change on its own. Its intensity softens. Its grip loosens. Its presence becomes lighter, not because you forced it to go away, but because you stopped holding it in place. This is where real elevation begins. Not in the mind, but in the body. Not through control, but through openness. So instead of asking, "How do I feel better?" the question becomes, "What happens if I stop resisting how I feel and simply allow it to move?" If your vibration is shaped by your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions, what happens when you stop trying to control them individually? Most people approach transformation by targeting each layer separately. They try to think better thoughts, generate better feelings, and take better actions, as if improvement comes from managing each piece more efficiently. But this creates fragmentation, because when these elements are not aligned, tension increases. You might think positively while feeling anxious. You might act confidently while internally doubting yourself. You might speak words of certainty while your body is signaling fear. And that incoherence is felt, not just by you, but by reality itself. Because what you project is not what you say or intend. It is the integrated signal of your entire system. This is why effort alone doesn't create change. You cannot override one layer while another remains in conflict. So, the question shifts. What if transformation is not about fixing each part, but about changing your relationship with all of them at once? When you stop forcing thoughts, they begin to settle. When you stop suppressing emotions, they begin to move. When you stop acting from fear, your actions begin to align naturally with clarity. This is coherence. Not something you manufacture, but something that emerges when resistance dissolves across all layers. And from a quantum perspective, coherence is what stabilizes your signal. It is what allows reality to reflect you more clearly, without distortion. So instead of asking, "How do I improve my thoughts, emotions, and actions?" a deeper question opens. What happens when I stop forcing them and allow them to reorganize from a place of internal alignment? What if the way you react today was never truly chosen by you? Look closely at your patterns, the way you respond under pressure, the emotions that rise in specific situations, the automatic thoughts that seem to appear before you even have time to think. Do they really feel new? Or do they feel familiar, almost rehearsed? Because much of what you experience as yourself was not consciously created. It was learned, conditioned, adapted. As a child, your system was constantly interpreting the world. It learned what was safe, what was not, what brought connection, what led to rejection, what earned approval, what triggered disapproval. And from those experiences, roles were formed. Maybe you learned to be the one who pleases, the one who avoids conflict, the one who stays quiet, the one who takes control. At the time, these patterns were intelligent. They helped you navigate your environment. They created a sense of safety. But what once protected you may now be limiting you, because these roles don't disappear with time. They become embedded in your nervous system. They shape how you perceive situations, how you interpret people, and how you respond, often before conscious awareness even has a chance to intervene. And this is why change can feel so difficult. Not because you lack discipline, but because you are trying to override patterns that were built for survival. So the question is no longer, "Why do I keep reacting this way?" It becomes something much more revealing. What part of me learned that this reaction was necessary, and is it still true today? If these patterns were learned, then who are you without them? This is where the journey becomes deeper and quieter. Because once you begin to see that your reactions, your roles, Even parts of your personality were shaped by past experiences, and new space opens. A space where you can question what you've always assumed to be you. But this can feel unsettling, because if you are not your patterns, if you are not the roles you've been playing, then what remains? Most people avoid this question, not because it lacks an answer, but because the answer cannot be found in the mind. It cannot be defined, labeled, or controlled. It can only be experienced. And what you begin to notice when you stop identifying with your conditioning is that there is something underneath it all, something stable, quiet, and untouched by your past. A presence, not the reactive part of you, not the defensive part, not the version of you trying to manage everything, but the one who is aware of all of it. This is not a new identity. It is what existed before the roles were formed. And the more you rest in this awareness, the less grip those patterns have. Not because you force them to change, but because you no longer reinforce them as who you are. This is where real freedom begins. Not in becoming someone new, but in no longer confusing yourself with what you learned to be. So the question becomes, if you are not your conditioning, not your patterns, not even your roles, who are you when none of that is running the show? If your patterns were created to protect you, what exactly are they protecting you from? This is where everything becomes more honest. Because beneath every reaction, every avoidance, every automatic behavior, there is something deeper that your system is trying not to feel. Not consciously, but instinctively. Your nervous system is not concerned with truth. It is concerned with safety. And if at some point in your life an emotion felt overwhelming, confusing, or threatening, your system adapted. It created strategies to prevent you from experiencing that same intensity again. And those strategies became patterns: avoidance, control, overthinking, people-pleasing, emotional shutdown. On the surface, they look like personality traits, but underneath, they are protection mechanisms. They are not random. They are precise. Each one is designed to keep you away from a specific emotional experience that, at some point, felt too much to handle. This is why patterns persist even when they no longer serve you. Because from the perspective of your nervous system, they're still doing their job. They are still keeping you safe. But safe from what? From rejection? From abandonment? From feeling not enough? From losing control? And here is the deeper layer. The behavior you see is never the real issue. It is the doorway. The real question is always underneath it. Because the moment you try to change the pattern without understanding what it protects, you create more resistance. You try to remove a shield while the system still believes it is necessary. So instead of asking, how do I stop this pattern? A more powerful question begins to emerge. What feeling has my system been trying to protect me from all this time? If your reactions are not flaws, but protection, what happens when you stop judging them? Most people approach their patterns with frustration. They see anxiety as weakness, avoidance as failure, people-pleasing as lack of boundaries, emotional shutdown as disconnection. And from that judgment, they try to fix themselves. But what if nothing about these responses is broken? What if each one is an intelligent adaptation, a precise response your nervous system developed to keep you safe in moments when you didn't have the capacity, support, or understanding to process what you were feeling? This is where the perspective shifts. Because instead of seeing these patterns as problems, you begin to recognize them as strategies. Fight, an attempt to regain control. Flight, an attempt to escape discomfort. Freeze, an attempt to minimize impact. Fawn, an attempt to maintain connection. Each one has a purpose. Each one was once necessary. And the moment you see that clearly, something softens inside you. The inner conflict begins to dissolve. because you are no longer at war with your own system. You are listening to it, understanding it, working with it, and from that place, change becomes possible, not through force, but through safety, because your system will only release a pattern when it no longer feels the need to protect you. So the real shift is not in eliminating these responses, it is in changing how you relate to them, seeing them not as enemies, but as signals. So the question becomes, what happens when, instead of trying to get rid of your patterns, you begin to understand what they have been trying to do for you all along? If your patterns are protecting you, what is the feeling they are hiding? This is where the surface begins to break. Because once you stop judging your reactions, once you stop trying to eliminate them, you create enough safety to look deeper. And beneath every behavior, there is something waiting. Not a thought, a feeling, unprocessed, unresolved, often unnamed. This is the hidden layer most people never reach, because the mind gets distracted by the behavior. Why do I do this? How do I stop? While the real answer is not in the behavior at all. It is in what the behavior is trying to keep you away from. And when you begin to slow down, to observe without reacting, to feel without escaping, something starts to reveal itself. Maybe it's a quiet sense of not being enough. Maybe it's the fear of being rejected or abandoned. Maybe it's a deep vulnerability you learned was unsafe to express. These are not dramatic realizations. They are subtle, but they carry weight because they have been influencing your entire system from beneath the surface, shaping how you relate, how you choose, how you perceive reality. And this is why change cannot happen at the level of behavior alone, because behavior is the expression, not the origin. The origin is emotional. And the moment you allow yourself to feel what has been avoided, not analyze it, not fix it, but truly feel it, something begins to shift. The pattern loses its function because the protection is no longer needed. So instead of asking, why do I keep doing this? A deeper question begins to open. What is this pattern trying to keep me from feeling, and am I finally ready to face it? What if the healing you've been searching for doesn't happen when you understand your emotions, but when you finally allow them to be felt? This is the point where everything becomes real, because insight is not the same as transformation. You can understand your patterns. You can explain your past. You can even identify the exact moment something began. And still, nothing changes. Why? Because the body has not completed the experience. Emotions are not just thoughts you interpret, they are physiological events. They move through your nervous system. They carry energy that was meant to be processed in real time. And when that process is interrupted, the experience remains open, unfinished. This is why certain feelings linger for years. Not because they are meant to stay, but because they were never fully felt. And feeling does not mean dramatizing, reacting, or becoming overwhelmed. It means allowing the sensation to exist in your body without trying to escape it, without labeling it as wrong, without rushing to resolve it. It means staying present with the discomfort long enough for it to complete its natural cycle. And here's what most people don't realize. Emotions, when fully felt, move. They rise, they peak, and they pass. But when resisted, they stay. So healing is not something you achieve through effort. It is something that unfolds when you stop interrupting the process, when you stop tightening against what is trying to move through you. And in that space, something begins to release. Not forcefully, not dramatically, but naturally. So the question becomes, what emotion have you been trying to understand instead of simply allowing yourself to feel? What if before love, before joy, before clarity, there is a state most people overlook completely? Neutrality. Not excitement. Not bliss. Not even peace as you might imagine it. Neutrality is the space where nothing is being resisted and nothing is being forced. And because it feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable at first, most people skip over it. They aim directly for high states. They want to feel amazing, expansive, elevated. But in doing so, they bypass the most important gateway. Because you cannot stabilize in love while you are still in conflict with what is. Neutrality is where that conflict dissolves. It is the moment when you stop labeling your experience as good or bad. When you stop needing something to change in order to feel okay. When you stop interpreting everything through preference, fear, or expectation. And for many, this feels like nothing is happening. But everything is happening. Because in neutrality, your system is no longer contracting. There is no resistance pulling you down. No attachment creating pressure. No internal argument trying to reshape reality. There is just openness. And from that openness, something begins to emerge naturally. Not forced positivity, not artificial calm, but a genuine lightness that doesn't depend on conditions. This is why neutrality is so powerful. It is stable. It is sustainable. It is the ground from which higher states can arise without effort. So instead of asking, "How do I feel better?" a more precise question begins to guide you. What happens when I stop needing this moment to be different and allow it to be exactly as it is? What if expansion doesn't happen when you try harder, but when you finally stop resisting what is already here? Most people believe growth requires effort, more discipline, more control, more intentional action. And while action has its place, there is a deeper layer that is often missed, the layer where expansion is not created but allowed. Because resistance is contraction. Every time you push against a feeling, deny a thought, or try to force reality into a different shape, your system tightens. And that tightening limits your capacity to experience anything beyond it. You don't just resist discomfort, you restrict expansion. This is why effort alone cannot elevate your state. Because if effort is driven by resistance, by the need to escape, fix, or control, it reinforces the very contraction you're trying to move beyond. But the moment you allow, everything begins to shift. Allowance is not passivity. It is not giving up. It is the conscious decision to stop fighting what is present, internally and externally, and create space for it to exist without interference. And here's what most people don't expect. The moment you fully allow a feeling, it begins to change. Not because you made it change, but because you stopped holding it in place. Resistance is what stabilizes unwanted states. Remove the resistance, and movement returns. This is expansion. Not something you achieve through effort, but something that unfolds when there is no longer anything blocking it. So instead of asking, "What do I need to do to grow?" a deeper question emerges. What am I still resisting that, if allowed, would naturally begin to transform? What if forgiveness is not something you think, but something your body finally releases? Most people approach forgiveness as a mental decision. They try to understand what happened. They justify it. They rationalize it. They tell themselves, "It's okay, I forgive." But underneath those words, the tension often remains. Why? Because the mind can declare forgiveness long before the body feels it. And real forgiveness is not a concept. It is a release. It is the moment your system no longer contracts when you remember, no longer tightens when you think about the person, the situation, or the past. It is when the emotional charge dissolves, not because you forced it, but because it has been fully processed. This is why trying to forgive too quickly can actually create more resistance. because you are asking your system to let go before it has been allowed to feel. True forgiveness does not come from bypassing pain. It comes from moving through it, from allowing the anger, the sadness, the disappointment, not to define you, but to complete their cycle, to be seen, felt, and released from the body. And here's where something profound happens. As the emotional charge dissolves, your perception begins to change. Not artificially, naturally. You begin to see the situation with more space, more clarity, sometimes even compassion, not because you forced yourself to feel it, but because the resistance that blocked it is no longer there. So forgiveness is not something you give to someone else. It is something you allow for yourself. And the question becomes, what am I still holding in my body that is ready to be released the moment I stop trying to forgive it and finally allow myself to feel it? What if the moment you truly understand someone is the moment you stop needing to resist them? Think about the last time you felt hurt, frustrated, or triggered by someone's behavior. What was happening internally? There was tension, judgment, a sense that something was wrong, that they shouldn't have acted that way, that they should have been different. And from that inner resistance, emotion intensified. But what if the intensity wasn't coming only from what they did, but from the meaning you assign to it? Because the mind doesn't just perceive behavior, it interprets it. It builds stories. They don't respect me. They don't care. They're trying to hurt me. And those interpretations create emotional reactions that feel absolute, even when they are incomplete. But what happens when you look deeper? When instead of reacting to the surface, you begin to ask, what might this person be feeling that led them to act this way? Not to excuse, not to justify, but to understand. Because every behavior, just like yours, is driven by an internal state, by fears, wounds, beliefs, and patterns that are often invisible from the outside. And the moment you see that, something shifts, the rigidity softens, the need to resist begins to dissolve, because understanding creates space. And in that space, compassion becomes possible. Not forced compassion, but natural. The kind that arises when you realize that what you're reacting to is not just a person's behavior, but their own unprocessed experience. And this doesn't mean you tolerate everything. It means you are no longer emotionally bound to it. So the question becomes, what changes in your experience when you stop reacting to behavior and begin to see the unseen pain behind it? What if the transformation you've been seeking was never about control, but about returning to flow? At this point, something should feel different. Not because you've learned a new technique, but because the entire direction has shifted. You are no longer trying to fix yourself, upgrade yourself, or force your way into a better state. You are beginning to relate to yourself differently. And that changes everything. Because real transformation stabilizes when your identity shifts, not in what you do, but in how you move through experience. You observe instead of react. You feel instead of suppress. You allow instead of control. And from that space, you act. Not from fear, not from urgency, but from alignment. This is the transition from control to flow. Control is rigid. It contracts. It is driven by the need to secure an outcome, to avoid discomfort, to maintain a sense of certainty. Flow is different. Flow is responsive. It is open. It moves with what is present, without losing direction. It does not mean passivity. It means clarity without resistance. And when you begin to live from this place, something stabilizes within you. Your reactions soften. Your decisions become cleaner. Your energy becomes coherent. Not because you force change, but because you are no longer interfering with your natural state. And this is where co-creation becomes real. Because reality responds not to effort, but to alignment. Not to who you're trying to become, but to who you are being. So the final question is not, how do I transform my life? It becomes something much simpler and far more powerful. What happens when I stop trying to control everything and finally allow myself to move in alignment with what already is? If this shifted something inside you, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs this message right now. And if you're ready to go deeper, stay here. This is just the beginning.